Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today, we're talking about the new hit series from Netflix, Three-Body Problem. We're joined by the showrunners, D.B. Weiss and David Benioff, who co-created Game of Thrones, and Alexander Wu, who also worked with HBO on True Blood. They have joined forces with Netflix to create this extraordinary new show. If you haven't seen it yet, it is a dazzling science fiction drama with incredible visuals and sound design. So I am excited to also welcome cinematographer Jonathan Freeman, sound designer Paula Fairfield, supervising sound editor Tim Kimmel, and editor Michael Ruscio for a comprehensive conversation on how they crafted this groundbreaking show. This is a good time to mention that we do discuss some mild spoilers, so you might want to make sure you are at least caught up through episode 5 before you listen to this conversation. Now, as you may know, Three-Body Problem is based on a series of best-selling books, which famously have been described as unadaptable for film and TV because of the complexities of the particle physics, which are at the heart of the premise of the story. So I wanted to start the conversation by asking how the creative team uses image and sound to overcome this challenge of unadaptability.
I think that one thing that was helpful is that while we're all three of us very interested in science, none of us are physicists. Shocking, I know. We probably thought we were physicists. We're not. We're phi curious, but we're not. We're not physicists. So we needed to first and foremost put it in language that we understood, and luckily we had a good amount of help doing this. Both the books themselves are written for people who are not scientists, and we had Matt Kenzie, our physics advisor, and Bobak Ferdowsi, our kind of JPL space and rocketry advisor, who helped us translate. We listened to them answer our questions. We listened to them answer the cast questions, and the way they explained things to people like us gave us a template for the way we could explain things to the people watching. And as you pointed out, Glenn, you have one thing you do have is you have imagery, which can really, even if you don't entirely understand all the explanation and scientific logic behind what you're seeing, it sometimes can still give you a flavor for what it means and how it feeds into the story that you're seeing.
Jonathan, I wanted to ask you, I know you co-shot episodes 1 and 2 with Richard Donnelly. So can you tell us a little bit about that collaboration and also about just sort of the additional work that the two of you did with Alex and Dan and David to establish the overall look of the series?
When I started, Richard sort of joined us partway through. I had to lead the project a bit early, and he took over and completed the 2 episodes beautifully. And that transition was very, very easy because I think we share a very similar aesthetic, and just again he absorbed sort of what we started and just continued and progressed the look as did all the other cinematographers going through the season. I guess one of the principal first things we asked ourselves is in terms of our storytelling is what aspect ratio we want to shoot this in, and we were very fortunate that Netflix had the options for us that we could choose which format, and we decided that a wider screen aspect ratio like a 2:3:5, which we decided on, would probably be the best for our first season storytelling because we'd be in a lot of environments that would be best represented horizontally, the landscapes. Dan, I think you even pointed out the later storyline, the Judgment Day tanker, also framed beautifully in that format. So all these things kind of led us to kind of, making that first step and the first decision. Plus, the power of 2:3:5 close-up is also a very different thing than other formats. It's much more internal, much more almost intensive at times, and we kind of leaned into that as well. And also for potentially for the future, just the scope that you can get from 2:3:5.
You shot in 2:3:5, but am I correct? Because it looks to me like what's happening with the out of focus elements in the background and lights and stuff, did you also shoot anamorphic?
We did. So that was the second thing that evolved in our initial discussions, is to choose the glass that we were going to use for the show. And, because we had so many different worlds and time periods that we were dealing with, we were kind of leaning towards, we wanted something like a traditional anamorphic aesthetic, which would, often the bulk of anamorphic lenses are very unique. But there's the challenge with some of those vintage lenses is that the center part of the lens actually is slightly distorted more often than not. And so a close-up on an actor sometimes can expand the face more than you would want it to be. And at the time, Greg Fraser had just finished The Batman, and he had been developing these lenses called the alpha lenses. They weren't called that at the time. They were prototypes for production that that area was going to release later in the year. And we tested the prototypes and reviewed it with everybody, and we ended up going with them. And the specific uniqueness of it is that it still had all those characteristics. The center was quite clean, if you will, without distortion. And so in some ways, it kind of helped us in terms of our storyline too, where you wanted something kind of classic, almost like a period film, but also something modern, like the center of the image. So in my head, it kind of worked out beautifully.
It looks fantastic, and I love that. I love that anamorphic look. For all of you guys, Alex, David, and Dan, maybe you want to start with this. One of the things that we love to talk about on this podcast is how you start. Like that first 10 minutes of a film or a TV show is so critically important to set mood and tone. And you guys have one of the most fascinating and arresting and powerful opening sequences of any show that I've seen in a long time. Can you talk about what motivated that decision to start with the Cultural Revolution sequence? And then for the rest of you guys, I'd love for you to talk about just the process of crafting that.
The book opens that way, and specifically the English translation of the book opens that way. In the original Chinese, it did not, because Cixin Liu's editor warned him that you might not get through the censors if you open your book with the struggle session. But he had intended for it to start with that sequence. And I think it's what drew us all in. You thought you were reading a science fiction novel, and then you start with this very grounded, brutal sequence, and you wonder how it's going to connect into this science fiction world. And it turns out to trigger a series of events that lead to the most pivotal decision made in the history of humanity. And one of the things one of the big challenges and also the advantages that we have in doing this for the screen, as Dan alluded to, is that when you're reading a novel, the reader's asked to put up a little theater in their mind, right? You imagine what it looks like, what it sounds like. But the novelist himself, Cixin Liu, had said, he always thought the novel was kind of a lo-fi way of conveying the ideas he wanted to convey, because you don't know how the reader is going to be able to lay out all the pieces and imagine how the whole thing is going to sound. And now we were given the challenge of actually showing what this looks like and what it sounds like in a way that for a reader of the novel would meet or exceed what they had even imagined, and something that also immerses you in what that experience was like. Luckily, none of us had ever been through a struggle session, but my family has lived through it. And when I showed it to my mother, she said, "That's real. That's really what happened." So that was a sign, at least, that we'd gotten it right.
Jonathan, can you talk about the approach to capturing that sequence and how you designed the look of it?
Well, again, I guess the approach, we really want to be honest to the time and wanted the viewer to be feel the intensity and the violence of the moment, how brutal these experiences were, and how traumatic they were. And so the first thing I think we all decided was that going handheld was sort of a way to kind of jump right in there, as if you were part of it was happening at the moment, and that there was no steadiness to it, if you will. And that immediately made it extremely challenging for our VFX team, which I think, this sequence is exceptionally beautifully crafted by VFX, because it's very complicated for them what they had to achieve, where we'd shoot basically a few hundred extras and have to replicate them. And that's difficult enough, but if your camera's constantly moving, that just requires a lot more layers of work and a lot more sophistication of how to create that virtual world that's extended. So anyway, I really think they did a phenomenal job.
Yeah, the sequence is just extraordinary. Tim and Paula, for that sequence from a sound perspective?
That one, obviously, I feel the most important thing was capturing the size and the intensity of the crowd. There was some production shot of all the chanting and everything, but to really, boost it up to feel like you're in there, we shot a ton of loop group. ADR supervisor Tim Hands was responsible for that, and we did a ton of loop group on that, on the chanting and the reactions, and really feeling, putting yourself in that moment to feel like you're there, to really feel the size of it. And then also, obviously, as the violence starts to come in, just to really make sure that you feel those hits, especially the last blow that delivered that took his life, capturing that intensity.
I want to talk about the VR world within this series, because I think that it provided such a playground for image and sound design. So, Dan, David, Alex, what were your original thoughts about the Santi technology, this VR world that they created? What were your instructions to your department heads and your creative team about what you wanted to communicate through that VR world, and how the audience should experience it?
Well, we wanted this VR experience to feel like it was so far beyond our capacity, given the current state of human technology, that it was, even to people who are scientists, high-level scientists, it felt impossible. And so given how the major strides we've made, as not us personally, but, like say people at Apple or Meta or whatever with VR over the last few years, it's clear that we're getting closer and closer to a photorealistic VR experience. So it had to be beyond that, and it had to engage all the senses. And so we didn't want it to feel like you were in a video game. We wanted to feel like you put on that helmet and you were transported to another world, which feels and looks and sounds just as real as our world, but it's not our world. And I think the most harried I've ever seen Jonathan Freeman, who's a very calm and gentle presence always on set. But the one time I've really seen him like tearing his hair out was trying to figure out how to light for a world with 3 suns. And it was just like all the rules of lighting had been thrown out the window, and he had to figure it all out. So that was the mandate, and it was, a real team effort, starting with, our incredible producing partner, Bernie Caulfield. Is part of the reason she's so great is she wants everything to be planned, so that once we're on set, like everyone knows their jobs. And so it was endless hours of meetings discussing, from Jonathan's perspective, how he was going to shoot this, and from the VFX team's perspective, how are they going to create the backgrounds for this world, and Deb Riley, our production designer, what the sets were going to look like that she was building. So a ton of planning went into it, and I hope that Jonathan has recovered from that, the problems of the shadows when you have 3 different suns.
Jonathan, he just threw you a softball. Tell us about lighting for 3 suns.
You didn't abandon me.
Of course not.
again, our goal was really to have the experience to be photorealistic, but at the same time, it is an alien world. So, we don't have reference for Three Sons, thankfully. So we could kind of fudge it a little bit in terms of that. But it ultimately still had to feel like these characters were being wrapped around by the light that they were experiencing, and the sequences that transition from night to dawn to day and back again within seconds sometimes, or minutes, or transit depending on the sequence. So we had to come up with a plan where the lighting would integrate properly with the characters in the scene, which were also on a landscape, which would then be extended virtually by the VFX team, and that lighting should be similar to what's being captured. So we basically came up with an alternate plan, which we call like a lower resolution volume. Still very expensive, and Bernie, our brilliant director, was finally able to find a way to make it work. But it was essentially an array of 1,200 sky panels, each almost acting as partial pixels. I think the dimensions were about 70 of them, 14 rows high, wrapped in almost like a hockey rink or half a hockey rink, and then a Ruscio scrim in front of it. So it would soften the light and create transitions that we could recreate skies and shift the color within seconds.
Tim and Paula, tell us about the sound design of these virtual environments.
Yeah, I mean, we were tasked with helping to do this world building, which is, complex world building is very difficult to do, and it's a long journey. And I think early on we had a good discussion about how, while this was sci-fi, we didn't want any of the traditional kind of sci-fi-y type sounds. And for me, that meant turning to really a kind of exclusively organic palette that then was twisted, and that went across through the Safon scene as well. But in the VR stuff, it was about, to me, it was about viscerality and also control in a way. You start out in world building as a sound designer. I'm looking at all the opportunities where I can attach a sound to something and figuring out what the palette might be. And in the end, as we kind of moved through that process, it was about, presenting to the team, okay, here's some ideas, and then filtering them down and really kind of honing in, so that the technology for me, in the end, what I felt and what I had in my mind the whole time was that the technology is dense and massive beyond anything we could imagine, and very condensed and compressed, but can be also very delicate and intentional and detailed. And so it was an interesting, play. And using the visual effects that came in, for me, I was following along and trying to tell the story using, and building this palette slowly. And it was, a lot of it at the beginning was, early sketches were too much, but you have to start there to figure out, what you want to filter down, what do you want to take away, what you want to focus, because sound can really focus your attention on stuff. And so that was the approach. And I think in the end, it worked really well because you had this sense of a massiveness, a hugeness beyond what we could comprehend of the technology, but it was very, very, very directional and very visceral and a lot of it was quite held back until moments where it could explode. And when it exploded, the explosions felt that much bigger. And I think that worked really well in terms of the flow throughout the entire season.
I love the way you talk about that. You brought up the Sophon sequence, which I want to spend some time talking about that. I want to, and specifically around episode 5. Michael, I'd love for you to come in and join us in the conversation, because I know you edited episode 5. And I think that Sophon sequence is it's one of those really tricky sequences, because it's sort of like, okay, we're gonna do some explaining now and kind of, you know, lay all this out and make it make sense. And so I would love to hear you talk about your approach to that Sophon sequence and how you kind of balance this need to keep the plot moving, you know, how to keep things moving forward, but actually take the time to give us the explanation that we've been waiting 5 episodes for how this is what's going on.
Well, it all starts on the page, of course, and what Dan and David and Alex had, you know, written. And as you know, with editorial, it goes through evolutions. You're sort of starting by just walking the dog, and then it ends up being a double-century bike ride. So initially, you know, we went through various versions of it, and, you know, and sort of finding the pieces. Okay, is this where Jess Hong and Liam Cunningham, they're looking up and they're seeing something amazing? Is this the best reaction that we have of that? You know, how much do we withhold? And primarily at the start, we didn't have a lot of visual effects in that sequence. So the very first cut of it, we had, you know, the Sophon had her words, and they had, you know, now we're going to see a proton unfolding, and we had, you know, chirons. It's like, you know, an amazing world is revealed, or the mirror, whatever else.
Even a tiny proton becomes something very large indeed. As a world.
But then as time went on, we had, and I was looking through, is that we had so many variations to you know, producer's cut and the second. I think one of the emails came in, and it was great with the 3 of them, because Dan, if I can sort of distill this, Dan was sort of the science guy, and David was sort of the human element, and Alex was like the logic police. So Dan was always really questing to see, okay, does this make sense scientifically? And he would always reach for that. So it went through a lot of permutations, a lot of rewrites, and a lot of working with VFX to say, okay, what are we really seeing here? And do we construct so it's like, and now you're going to see this, and ta-da, and they look up and there's like some sonic pizzazz that happens, you know, over a title card initially, or is it better to sort of have it be explained? And we sort of honed it in. I think that making it as simple and digestible as possible over time, so that, okay, you can get this. This doesn't even matter. It's too scientific. No one's really going to pay attention to that. And we basically have to, you know, it's sort of the preamble to what happens, you know, on Earth. So at a certain point, it's just the initial phase of the journey. And I think that the showrunners were just so great about being specific and sort of letting me contribute. But a lot of times the way I contributed was that basically that my assistant's wife would do new ADR lines, or we would, and that would be a template for how we went forward, because it went through many stages. We edited that a long time.
Alex, Dan, and Dave, I'm kind of curious. Tell us a little bit about that editorial process. And are you editing all episodes at is everything kind of live, and you're working on all episodes at the same time, or kind of how do you structure your flow through the post?
Well, I'm spending half my days in the lab, so it really limits the amount of time I can spend on editing and sound and all these other things. But no, we're always. I mean, it's kind of an ongoing process where you're always cutting. You know, the cutting comes first, and you're always cutting. You're always seeing assemblies and director's cuts. Sometimes you're seeing director's cuts of individual scenes because you need to get them to visual effects sooner rather than later. And it's kind of like, this is a reference that ages me, but I often think of like Lucy and Ethel from I Love Lucy on the candy line. It's not a reference that's okay for everyone on this call. Anybody under the age of like 45 is going to be wondering what the hell I'm talking about. But it's just like first off the conveyor belt, first into your mouth. It's like you're just kind of going through all of this stuff. But once you're done shooting, you really get to sit down and you get to focus editorially on fine tuning the stuff that you haven't had to fine tune, already. And I think we all love that part of the process because it really is. It's like editing is writing in a way. I mean, don't tell the Writers Guild, but like editing is really you're almost rewriting. Often just through the choices you make are often amount to rewriting the things that you put on the page to begin with, and things that made sense on the page don't make sense editorial, and things that people like Michael, for instance, discover in the footage are things that weren't ever there on the page, and they're better than what was there on the page. And so you immediately recognize, well, that beats our idea for what this was, and that beats our idea for the way this was supposed to go. So let's immediately change gears and go with that.
I'd say on this season, the rewriting that Dan was talking about, the post-production rewriting, because we're figuring out the show as we're putting together the season, and so it was extensive. I'd remember on Game of Thrones, we would get to cut E, and I'd always remember thinking, okay, we're pretty much done because cut E looks like cute, and I would always think when we got the cute cut from the editor, we're probably almost done. Very few cuts went beyond cut E. On this show, we had at least one episode that went to cut A, B, I think it was, right? So we went and had to start over again. And episode 5, I don't know what letter we ended up with on that one, but yeah, as Michael was talking about, just that Sophon sequence probably went through 60 different cuts or something. I mean, it was, and a lot of true rewriting. And that one, we were fortunate enough that you had a lot of voiceover from Sophon, so you could do a lot of rewriting and get C in again and again to do ADR for it. But yeah, I mean, it was an interesting process to kind of learn, like, oh, that's what the show is as a year after you'd shot it.
One other sequence I want to talk about in that episode 5 is the destruction of the Judgment Day ship, which is just such an extraordinary sequence, and it's such a great set piece. Michael, Tim, Jonathan, I know you didn't shoot that episode, but Tim and Paula, tell me about what was your reaction when you first read that in the script? I've just got so many questions about this particular sequence and how it came together.
For me, it was I'm in, because basically they had called me and I read the book, and then I was like, oh, great, I get to do this. When do I start? And then I'd worked with the director Minky before, and she was really, I think, influential a little bit in bringing in a lot of like the idea of the children, just setting them up, not necessarily seeing them get chopped, but having them be on board. And so that we knew that there was a cost to this. And then just working so closely with the VFX team between what was, practical on set, what was built, what Deb Riley built, and then what we had to use as extensions. And, also the timing of it evolved, because basically people would be ducking under, fluorescents, and that would be them being chopped. And so it's like, okay, my assistant would put in sound, is like, they're dead already. We need to move on to the next shot. So
one of my questions was about that interplay between practical effects and VFX. It's always the case. Like sometimes the simplest stuff has the greatest visceral impact. I'm thinking about that shot with the kids' construction paper figures on the wall that just sort of, that it just slices through, and that actually has as much emotional impact as some of the bigger stuff. So I would love for you guys to talk about kind of the design of that sequence and how you figured out the interplay between what was going to be shot practically versus CG.
I'm glad you singled out that shot, because that might be my favorite shot in the whole season. And it's VFX. I mean, that particular shot is VFX, or at least once the paper legs start fluttering down. But there's also some practical shots, like the backpacks getting sliced open, and I think for anyone who has kids and who has put their backpack up on those little pegs at their nursery school or whatever, it really gets you. But I think it all goes back to, talking about Bernie before and these very, very long meetings where all the department heads are there talking about how are we going to do this thing. And one of my fond memories of pre-production for this particular episode was being with Minky, the director, in one of the corridors of the Judgment Day, which Deb Riley had designed and built. And there was like a little LED strip that ran along the baseboard, and it blinked with the timing that the wires were going to cross the ship, so that special effects could know, okay, here's where we cut things, like here's where we cut the glass, and VFX would know what the timing was, that the stunt coordinator could know like when his stunties, where they'd be running and where they'd fall because they've been sliced. But all the different departments had to come together to try to make something that seems seamless, which it certainly wasn't until the very, very end. It took a lot of post work and a lot of Michael work, getting everything lined up properly. And it's pretty fascinating because we just saw the VFX reel that they're submitting for awards things. It's pretty fascinating to see everything that they did with it, because we shot it on a backlot in Shepperton in London. There was no water involved. There's no ship. There was nothing. So it was a great team effort, I think.
What was fascinating about it was to see how elastic the material could become. And then sometimes there were restrictions, like on the boat, there was a specific geography and you knew how much you could extend. Like, of course, with Jonathan Pryce, you want him to stay alive as long as possible. So there was a certain logic that Deb had designed as far as what part of the ship, and when he goes to see Felix, and then he goes into that sort of machine control operation room where he meets his demise, and sort of finding out how much you could actually still keep character in there within what was a very modulated, exacting, nanofiber that no one's ever seen before, and how that kind of was syncopated was a fun thing to keep working on. I think that all of us just kept really just dialing into what was going to be the most effective, how much you were going to see, and parsing it out. Like, we started with, we called him Jose on the ship, where you just basically see the hose moving, and you're not really sure what's happening. And it's sort of gradually and then finally, ultimately, you see this horrible ship completely destroyed. And I think it was like, how much do we deal it out? And what do we withhold? And what do we wait for the big bang?
Tim and Paula, I wanted to ask you about designing the sound of the technology of the Santee, and specifically, it's such a simple thing, but tell me about the design of the sound of the hallucinatory countdowns, and kind of how that evolved and how you arrived at that.
Well, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of conversations. We tried to assign something specific to it, I think, at the beginning, and it was a countdown, and we tried different kind of counting clock kind of tick stuff and whatever. And as we went through it, I think one of the things we wanted to make sure didn't happen was that it felt like it was just in her head, and that it was, and also because it showed up in all kinds of different situations. So there were multiple layers of stuff, from a slight kind of counting thing to stuff that was more abstract that could pull out of the sonic environment and back in again. And then I think also some music elements were involved in that too in the end. So, for me, I came up with a kind of a palette of stuff that I attached to each of the sequences, and then On the stage, it was really kind of case by case, because sometimes there was conversation going on. It was something more emotional. Do we want to hear it at all? We acknowledge it. We see it. We just feel it. And so it was quite an organic design in the end. And Tim can talk a little bit more about what happened on the stage.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we need to be careful of, and I remember a discussion on stage with you guys about this, was that we never wanted any of the sounds from it, one, not to ever reference each second, so it was never ticking in any way, but also that it never came across as an auditory hallucination, that she was hearing it as well. So it was definitely a lot of interplay between the design and the music, and, as you were saying, the moment. Some moments we didn't play any sound for it, some we did, some music led it. It really was a case by case basis on just what worked for that moment. It was definitely very abstract. So it was a little, I think the viewer doesn't know what's coming from music, what's coming from sound design. They work well together.
Really, for all of you, you're on the Dolby podcast, so the experience of the show is just so extraordinary in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. I wanted to ask you guys about what's exciting to you about using HDR and immersive sound to tell a story like Three Body Problem, and maybe for Tim and Paula, what were some of the great Atmos moments in the show?
For us on the sound side, we definitely took advantage of the Atmos moments in the VR world. Really capturing feeling in that moment using the space of, I think one of the big moments I'm thinking of is when gravity stops in the one sequence and just feeling everything around you. That's definitely immersed ourselves, using Atmos and panning and everything that way. Also in the opening sequence, to put yourself in the crowd. There were a lot of opportunities to take advantage of putting the viewer, the listener, in the center of it and being able to feel, as part of it.
I would just say, as a technological noob, anything that helps immerse the audience, anything that helps create that willing suspension of disbelief that you're always trying to provide for the audience is a plus. And one of the things we didn't really mention before, but we have the great advantage of Dan and I had worked before, for a long time with Tim and Paula and Jonathan. But I can remember when this new Dolby technology became available, it was, kind of towards the end of our Thrones run, and remember being on stage and like hearing some of the first stuff, and talking to Greg Spence, who was our post-production czar at that point. And just when you hear it and just these moments where you really feel like you're in the world, it just heightens the whole experience, and it makes you, it just adds that extra layer. And oftentimes you're not even conscious of it. I mean, I think I probably wouldn't have been conscious if, someone like Tim hadn't been there saying, and here's where we're doing this. And so it's kind of a fascinating process. Again, like it goes back to what Jonathan was saying before about the choice with the aspect ratio and the lenses he chose and everything else. Like I'm often not aware of that stuff when I'm watching something, but you trust the people that you've worked with before who have done great work for you. So when Jonathan said, "This is how I want to go anamorphic," we were like, "Great." And it wasn't really so much because we had read the scripts and thought, this should definitely be shot anamorphic, is because we trust Jonathan. Like Jonathan always makes everything look great. So if he's decided this is the proper look for the show, knowing him and knowing his taste, it made it an easy choice. But like you, Glenn, like I almost never think about it, except I'm not sure if this is like you, but you mentioned this before. When you see the background out of focus lights and they get that kind of anamorphic distortion, that's really the only time I'm consciously thinking of it. And I always love it. It always makes me happy when I see those little distortions back there. But it is a great advantage of working on series television that, for series that go on for several years, where you really get to have this kind of very close working relationship with the people you know and love.
One aspect of the Dolby Atmos, which I think is really extension in episode 5, is the huge sonic crashing booms of the ship getting shot, chopped up, and then going into this trailer with the absence of sound. So you're acutely aware of there's a presence there, but it's not that environment that I just heard. So I think there's a real yo-yo effect on your ears as far as how much you're starring the Dolby sound. And silence is equally hard to do, but that Atmos is like it's still around you, and you have that kind of contrast, which was great that we had that technology to make that really sing.
Well, everyone, it's been amazing being in conversation with you today about Three Body Problem. As I said up at the top, we're just huge fans of this extraordinary achievement, and we're all looking forward to a season 2, hopefully soon. Thanks.
As are we.
Thanks so much, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you, Glenn.
It's great
Thanks,
to see
everyone.
everybody.
Many thanks to showrunners Dan, David, and Alex, as well as Jonathan, Paula, Tim, and Michael for joining us on the podcast today. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Netflix for juggling everyone's hectic schedules to help us put this conversation together. Be sure to check out Three Body Problem, now streaming on Netflix in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists, filmmakers, and showrunners about how they use technology to tell their stories, please be sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Creator Talks podcast. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thank you for joining us.